The blood on the white silk was the first warning. Most mafia brides accept their gilded cages, but Penelope didn't just walk away on her wedding night. She vanished into thin air. 2 years later, the undisputed king of Boston's underworld just caught her unmistakable perfume in a federal courtroom. The wedding of Dominic Gallo and Penelope Hayes was the kind of event that practically choked the city of Boston with its opulence. Held on a sweltering evening in June, the reception at the Fairmont Copley Plaza was a masterclass in power and intimidation, disguised beneath walls of imported white orchids and vintage champagne. Dominic was the head of the Gallo Syndicate, a man whose whispered name dictated the ebb and flow of New England's illegal imports, gambling rings, and political corruption. And his bride? She was the anomaly that the entire underworld could not stop whispering about. Penelope was not bred for this life. She didn't come from a lineage of capos or bosses. She was an art restorer who worked quietly in a dusty studio in the South End. Furthermore, Penelope didn't fit the mold of the razor-thin, surgically enhanced mob wives who usually graced the arms of made men. Penelope was unapologetically fat, possessing a lush, full-figured silhouette that she refused to hide or apologize for. Where others saw a woman who didn't fit the brutal, superficial standards of his world, Dominic saw an absolute goddess. He was obsessed with the soft curves of her waist, the fullness of her hips, and the fiery, stubborn spirit that lived inside her. He worshipped her size, finding a profound, grounding comfort in her warmth and her absolute refusal to shrink herself for anyone, not even the most dangerous man in Massachusetts. He had moved mountains to make her his. He had courted her with a terrifying intensity, showering her with affection and a fierce protection that ultimately wore down her defenses. By the time they said their vows at St. Stephen's, Dominic believed he had secured the only pure thing in his violent life. The reception was winding down when the nightmare began. They had retired to the presidential suite on the top floor. Penelope, exhausted but radiant, in a custom Vera Wang gown designed specifically to celebrate her heavy, gorgeous curves, had kicked off her heels and disappeared into the sprawling marble bathroom to draw a bath. Dominic was loosening his bow tie, pouring them both a glass of Macallan, when his encrypted burner phone vibrated in his tuxedo jacket. It was Vincent, his underboss. A dispute at the docks had escalated. A shipment of untraceable firearms had been intercepted by a rogue faction of the Falcone family. Dominic needed to give the kill order, and he needed to do it in person, out of earshot of the suite's walls. "I'll be right back, amore mio," Dominic called out toward the bathroom door, hearing the sound of running water. 5 minutes. He stepped out into the heavily guarded hallway, flanked by 2 of his most trusted soldiers, Leo and Carmine. He descended to the lobby, made the call from a secure room, and returned exactly 7 minutes later. When Dominic pushed open the heavy oak doors of the presidential suite, the silence was absolute. The water in the bathroom was still running, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The air felt dead. "Penelope," he called out, his voice a low rumble that usually commanded instant attention. No answer. Dominic's heart performed a cold, heavy stutter. He drew his sidearm, a sleek, suppressed Kimber 1911, and moved methodically through the living area. The first thing he noticed was the smashed crystal on the floor. His glass of scotch had been shattered against the wall. Then he saw it. Draped over the edge of the velvet chaise lounge was Penelope's heavy, pearl-encrusted veil. Right in the center of the delicate tulle was a single, undeniable smear of crimson blood. "Penelope!" Dominic roared, kicking the bathroom door wide open. The tub was overflowing, water spilling over the pristine white marble. The room was empty. The window in the master bedroom, which overlooked the fire escape and the alleyway below, was wide open, the sheer curtains blowing wildly in the humid night air. Dominic tore the room apart. He sent Leo and Carmine down the fire escape. He mobilized 100 armed men within the hour, locking down every bridge, tunnel, and highway leaving Boston. He paid off the Boston police dispatchers to delay any official response, while his men scoured the streets, tearing through rival hangouts and turning the city upside down. The security cameras in the hotel had been expertly looped. The guards stationed at the freight elevator in the back had been rendered unconscious by a paralytic agent, leaving no trace of a struggle. A single black SUV with stolen plates was caught on a traffic cam, running a red light near the Ted Williams tunnel. But it was found torched in a salvage yard in Revere 3 hours later. Inside the charred remains of the vehicle was a burner phone and a small, bloody piece of Penelope's wedding dress. She was gone. The woman who had finally given the monster a heart had been violently ripped from him on the night he swore to protect her forever. The Gallo family went to war. Assuming the rival Falcone syndicate had orchestrated the kidnapping to break him, Dominic unleashed a reign of terror that painted the cobblestone streets of Boston red. Over the next 6 months, 12 Falcone associates disappeared. Warehouses were burned to the ground. Politicians were blackmailed into launching federal raids. Dominic interrogated capos with his own bare hands, breaking fingers and fracturing skulls, screaming his wife's name until his voice gave out. But no one knew anything. The Falcones were bleeding out, swearing on their mothers' graves that they had nothing to do with the bride's disappearance. There were no ransom notes, no demands, no proof of life. Penelope Hayes had simply ceased to exist. 2 years is a long time for a wound to fester in the dark. By September of 2026, Dominic Gallo was a shell of the man who had stood at the altar. The love that had briefly softened his edges had calcified into a cold, ruthless paranoia. He trusted no one. He slept in a different, secure location every night. His empire had grown, feeding on his bottomless grief and unyielding rage. He had eradicated the Falcone family's upper management, leaving their organization in tatters, which brought him to the John Joseph Moakley United States Courthouse on a crisp Tuesday morning. The federal government, capitalizing on the chaos Dominic had caused, was finalizing a massive RICO case against the remnants of the Falcone organization. Dominic, dressed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit that looked more like armor, sat in the very back row of the public gallery. He was surrounded by 4 of his most imposing men, a silent, terrifying presence that made the prosecuting attorneys sweat and the defense lawyers stutter. Dominic was there to watch his enemies rot. But more importantly, he was there because he still held on to the irrational, desperate hope that someone on the stand might slip up and mention Penelope. The courtroom was vast, with towering glass walls that looked out over the grey, choppy waters of Boston Harbor. The air conditioning pumped heavily, keeping the room at a crisp, sterile temperature. Assistant U.S. Attorney Mitchell Graham was pacing in front of the jury box, aggressively questioning a turncoat Falcone accountant. Dominic was bored. He rested his chin on his steepled fingers, his dark, deadened eyes staring a hole into the back of the witness's head. The testimony was dry. Offshore accounts, shell companies, wire frauds. Nothing about kidnappings. Nothing about a beautiful, plus-size bride with a laugh that could stop traffic. Then the heavy oak doors at the front of the courtroom, near the judge's chambers, swung open. A woman walked in, carrying a thick stack of manila folders. She was a paralegal, evidently brought in to deliver emergency documents to Mitchell Graham. Dominic didn't look at her at first. His gaze remained locked on the witness. But then, the woman handed the files to the prosecutor, leaning over the wooden partition. As she did, she shifted her weight. Dominic's eyes flicked toward the movement. The woman was wearing a conservative, ill-fitting navy blue pantsuit, her hair dyed a harsh, flat black and pulled into a tight, severe bun at the nape of her neck. A pair of thick, wire-rimmed glasses obscured her face. But you cannot hide the architecture of a body from a man who has memorized every inch of it. Dominic's breath hitched in his chest. Despite the oversized, matronly cut of the blazer, he recognized the slope of her shoulders. He recognized the heavy, beautiful curve of her hips, the thickness of her thighs pressing against the cheap fabric of the trousers. It was a lush, full figure that he had worshipped in the dark, a silhouette that was entirely unique to her. He sat up straighter, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "No," he told himself, "you're hallucinating. You've done this 100 times on the street." He gripped the wooden bench in front of him, his knuckles turning stark white. He watched the woman turn around to walk back toward the chambers. As she moved across the room, she crossed directly over an air conditioning vent set into the floorboards. The sudden updraft of air caught her, billowing the jacket slightly and catching the scent she wore, carrying it directly through the cold, sterile air of the courtroom, straight toward the back row of the gallery. It hit Dominic like a physical blow to the face. It wasn't a generic perfume. It wasn't something bought at a department store. It was Maison Francis Courcgian's Baccarat Rouge 540, cut with a very specific, heavy drop of absolute Sicilian bergamot and Madagascar vanilla. It was a bespoke fragrance. Dominic knew this for a fact, because 3 years ago he had flown a master perfumer from Paris to Boston and paid him $50,000 to create that exact, unique scent exclusively for Penelope. Nobody else in the world had that formula. Dominic stood up. The movement was abrupt, jarring the heavy wooden bench and causing a loud screech against the floorboards. Heads snapped toward him. The U.S. Marshal standing near the door immediately rested a hand on his holster. The woman in the navy pantsuit froze. She was 10 feet away from the exit. Slowly, as if pulled by an invisible, terrifying string, she turned her head and looked over her shoulder, directly up at the back row of the gallery. The thick glasses and black hair couldn't hide the wide, terrified hazel eyes. They were the exact same eyes that had looked up at him as he slid a wedding band onto her finger. It was Penelope. The air in Dominic's lungs vanished. The world around him tunneled, the sounds of the judge's gavel and the prosecutor's voice fading into a dull, underwater hum. She was alive. She was standing right in front of him. But she wasn't chained to a radiator in a basement. She wasn't a prisoner of the Falcone family. She was carrying legal documents for the federal government. She was walking freely through a heavily guarded U.S. courthouse, working alongside the very people trying to dismantle the mafia. She looked at Dominic, and in that split second, the truth crashed down on him with the force of a falling building. The blood on the veil, the looped cameras, the perfectly timed escape out the window. She hadn't been taken by his enemies. She had run from him. And as Penelope broke eye contact, abandoning her professional composure to practically sprint through the heavy oak doors and out of the courtroom, Dominic Gallo realized that the greatest betrayal of his life hadn't come from a rival syndicate. It had come from the only woman he had ever loved. "Leo," Dominic whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying absolute rage as he stepped out into the aisle. "Lock down the building. No one leaves." The John Joseph Moakley United States Courthouse is a fortress of federal power, a sprawling architectural marvel of steel, glass, and polished granite designed to withstand terrorist attacks and natural disasters. It was never designed to withstand Dominic Gallo. As Penelope practically threw herself through the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, the adrenaline hitting her bloodstream was thick and suffocating. Her low-heeled orthotic shoes, a humiliating downgrade from the Louboutins she used to wear, necessitated by her deep-cover identity as a low-level paralegal, slapped frantically against the gleaming marble floors of the corridor. Her heavy chest heaved, the cheap, restrictive fabric of her navy pantsuit digging into her full waist and lush hips as she sprinted toward the nearest emergency stairwell. She had made a catastrophic mistake. After 2 years of absolute discipline, hiding in plain sight within the witness protection program under the name Brenda Walsh, she had let her guard down. She had requested a transfer to the records division, mistakenly believing that Dominic never attended the tedious financial proceedings of the Falcone Rico case. She hadn't counted on the air conditioning vent. She hadn't counted on the scent. Behind her, she heard the terrifying, unmistakable sound of absolute chaos erupting in courtroom 7. "Secure the exits! Nobody gets out!" Dominic's voice boomed, echoing down the Quernus hallway. It wasn't the voice of a man making a request. It was the voice of an apex predator coordinating a hunt. Penelope slammed her shoulder into the metal fire door, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. She practically fell into the concrete stairwell, the door clicking shut behind her, just as she heard the heavy, synchronized thud of Dominic's men storming the hallway. She grabbed the cold metal railing and began to descend, her thighs burning, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was a big woman, and while she carried her lush, heavy curves with a sensual grace that had once driven Boston's most dangerous man to his knees, sprinting down 30 flights of concrete stairs was a physical nightmare. Sweat broke out across her forehead, ruining the severe, slicked-back bun she had spent 30 minutes perfecting that morning. On the 22nd floor, her burner phone vibrated aggressively in her blazer pocket. She snatched it out, her fingers trembling so violently she nearly dropped it down the open stairwell shaft. "Where are you?" barked the voice on the other end. It was Special Agent Harrison Brooks, her federal handler. "He saw me," Penelope gasped, leaning against the cinder-block wall, clutching her chest as she tried to force oxygen into her burning lungs. "Harrison, Dominic is here. He saw me in the courtroom. He recognized my perfume. He's locking down the building." "That's impossible," Harrison snapped, the panic evident even through the encrypted line. "Gallo doesn't have the authority to lock down a federal courthouse. He owns half the marshals in this city, and you know it," Penelope cried out, a sob tearing at her throat. "The alarms aren't sounding. The building isn't going into official lockdown. He's doing it quietly. His men are covering the exits. I need an extraction team right now, or I am a dead woman." "Listen to me," Harrison ordered, his voice dropping an octave. "Do not go to the lobby. His soldiers will be watching the metal detectors. Get to the sub-basement, the archival storage levels. There is an old maintenance tunnel that connects to the waterfront utility grid. I will send a tactical team to breach the tunnel grate from the outside. Move, Penelope. Now." The line went dead. Penelope shoved the phone back into her pocket and pushed off the wall. She forced her heavy, aching legs to keep moving, descending deeper into the belly of the courthouse. Meanwhile, 3 floors above her, Dominic was operating with a cold, terrifying precision. He had bypassed the frantic U.S. Marshals, two of whom were actively turning a blind eye as Leo and Carmine effectively took over the security feeds in the control room. Dominic stood in the center of the marble corridor, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his dark eyes entirely devoid of humanity. "She went down the eastern stairwell, boss," Leo reported through the earpiece, his voice tight. Cameras caught a woman matching the description. Heavy-set, dark hair, glasses, navy suit. She's moving fast, passing the 15th floor. "Cut the power to the elevators," Dominic commanded, his voice a low, lethal rumble. "I don't want any federal agents getting down there before I do. Send Carmine to cover the loading dock. I will take the stairwell." Dominic didn't run. He didn't need to. He moved with the calculated, predatory stride of a man who already knew he had won. He opened the fire door to the eastern stairwell and began his descent. The air in the concrete shaft was stale, but as he moved downward, he caught it again. The faint, lingering ghost of Baccarat Rouge 540, cut with Sicilian bergamot. The scent wrapped around his lungs, pulling him downward, dragging him back into a maddening spiral of obsession and rage. For 2 years, he had mourned her. He had ordered executions in her name. He had kissed the bloody fabric of her wedding veil every night before he slept. And all this time, she had been breathing the same Boston air, working for the very people trying to put him in a concrete box for the rest of his life. By the time Penelope reached the sub-basement, she was entirely exhausted. The heavy metal door reading, "Restricted, archival storage," was locked, secured by a biometric keypad. Cursing under her breath, she reached into her bra and pulled out the overriding keycard Harrison had given her for emergencies. She swiped it, her hands slick with sweat. The light blinked green, and the heavy door gave way. She stumbled into the cavernous room. It was completely dark, the only illumination coming from the small emergency lights, spaced every 50 feet along the ceiling. The room was a massive maze of towering metal shelving units, packed tight with thousands of cardboard banker's boxes containing decades of federal case files. The air smelled of old paper, dust, and metallic ozone. She navigated through the narrow aisles, her full hips brushing against the metal shelving as she desperately searched for the access panel on the far north wall that led to the utility tunnels. Every shadow looked like a hitman. Every creak of the building sounded like footsteps. She found the panel. It was a heavy steel grate, bolted into the concrete. Penelope dropped to her knees, her nylons tearing on the rough floor, and grabbed the heavy iron latch. She pulled with all her might, gritting her teeth, using the full weight of her lush body to try and force the rusted mechanism to budge. It wouldn't move. "Come on," she sobbed, pulling until her palms blistered. "Come on, please." Then the heavy metal door at the entrance of the archive room clicked shut. The sound echoed through the vast, dark space like a gunshot. Penelope froze. The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying, and profound. "Did you really think," a voice rumbled from the darkness, smooth as crushed velvet and sharp as broken glass, "that you could outrun me, Penelope? Did you think a cheap bottle of black hair dye and a baggy suit could hide what belongs to me?" The sound of his voice stripped the air from her lungs. Penelope slowly stood up, her back pressed against the cold steel grate of the utility panel. She couldn't see him yet. He was moving silently through the labyrinth of metal shelving, but she could feel the oppressive, terrifying weight of his presence closing in on her. "Dominic," she whispered, her voice trembling, betrayed by a sudden treacherous tear that slipped down her cheek. "Don't say my name," he commanded, the voice suddenly much closer, coming from the adjacent aisle. "You lost the right to speak my name the night you left your bloody veil on our bed." A tall, broad shadow detached itself from the darkness at the end of the aisle. Dominic stepped into the dim, ambient glow of the emergency lights. He looked magnificent, terrifying, and entirely destroyed. The lines around his mouth were deeper, his eyes completely hollowed out, hollowed by a grief she had forced him to endure. He held his suppressed Kimber 1911 down at his side, the safety already clicked off. He stopped 10 feet away from her. His dark, dead eyes swept over her, dissecting her disguise. He looked at the harsh black hair, the thick glasses she wore, the terrible navy suit that attempted to hide the spectacular, heavy curves he used to worship with his hands and mouth. "You look ridiculous," Dominic said quietly, though his jaw was clenched so tight the muscle twitched. "Take the glasses off." Penelope's hands shook as she reached up, pulling the wire frames from her face and letting them clatter to the concrete floor. She looked at him, her hazel eyes wide with a mixture of terror and an agonizing, buried love she had spent 2 years trying to kill. "You have no idea what happened, Dominic," she choked out, pressing her soft, heavy shoulders back against the concrete wall. "You don't know the truth." "The truth?" Dominic took a slow, deliberate step forward. "The truth is that I burned this city to the ground for you. I tortured men to death, thinking they had hurt you. I sat in empty rooms holding a piece of your bloody dress, begging God to give you back to me. And you were here, filing paperwork for Mitchell Graham." He raised the gun, aiming it directly at the center of her chest. "Tell me why I shouldn't put a bullet in your heart right now." Penelope didn't flinch. The fear suddenly drained out of her, replaced by a deep, defensive anger. She stood tall, refusing to shrink her plus-size frame, letting her natural, commanding presence fill the space between them. "Because Mitchell Graham was going to put my brother in federal prison for 30 years, Dominic," she screamed, the sound echoing violently off the metal shelves. Dominic froze, the gun wavering a fraction of an inch. "What? My brother?" Penelope spat, tears streaming freely down her face, ruining her makeup. 2 days before our wedding, Assistant U.S. Attorney Mitchell Graham came to my art restoration studio. He didn't come to talk about you. He came with a thick file of forged wire transfers and fabricated witness testimonies. He had manufactured a flawless paper trail connecting my younger brother to an international child trafficking ring. Dominic's eyes widened slightly, the dark, lethal mask cracking just a fraction. "Graham told me the truth," Penelope continued, her voice shaking with rage. "He told me he fabricated the evidence. He told me the judge was in his pocket. He said that if I went through with the wedding, if I became your wife, he would arrest my brother on our wedding night. He would make sure he was sent to a maximum security federal penitentiary, and he would make sure my brother was murdered within the first week." "Why didn't you tell me?" Dominic demanded, his voice raising to a furious roar. "I could have killed Graham. I could have dismantled his entire life." "Because Graham had a dead man's switch," Penelope shouted back. "He told me that if anything happened to him, or if I breathed a word of this to you, the federal indictments would automatically unseal. My brother would be dead, Dominic. You know how this world works. You control the streets, but Graham controls the federal system. I couldn't risk my brother's life." "So you made a deal with the devil," Dominic whispered, the realization settling heavily into his bones. "He gave me an ultimatum," Penelope sobbed, wrapping her arms around her full waist, suddenly feeling very cold. "Fake my death on my wedding night. Disappear into WITSEC. Hand over the encrypted ledgers you kept hidden in the antique canvases in my studio. If I did that, He would bury the fake evidence against my brother forever. That's why the cameras were looped. That's why the marshals helped me escape out the window. I cut my own arm with a piece of shattered crystal to leave the blood on the veil. I had to make it look like a rival hit. If you thought I ran, you would never stop looking for me. If you thought I was taken by the Falcones, I knew you would destroy them. And I knew Graham wanted you to destroy them so he could sweep up the ashes. Dominic slowly lowered the gun. The silence in the archive room was deafening. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together in his mind with horrifying clarity. Mitchell Graham hadn't just built a Ryko case. He had manipulated the head of the Gallo family into doing his dirty work, using Penelope's beautiful, heavy heart against her. "You sacrificed yourself," Dominic said softly, his voice stripped of the rage, leaving only a raw, bleeding awe. "You let me think you were dead to save your brother." "I did what I had to do," Penelope whispered, closing her eyes. "I loved you, Dominic. I loved you so much it physically hurt. But I couldn't build our marriage on my brother's grave. Now you know. So if you're going to kill me for betraying you, just do it. But please, don't let Graham hurt my family." Dominic stared at the woman in front of him. He looked at the beautiful, thick curve of her thighs, the soft, lush stomach she was currently hugging, the fierce, unyielding loyalty that had driven her to ruin her own life. He didn't see a traitor. He saw the only creature in the universe worthy of his worship. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Penelope squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the gunshot. Instead, she heard the heavy clatter of the Kimber 1911 hitting the concrete floor. Before she could open her eyes, Dominic's large, calloused hands violently gripped her hips. He hauled her heavy, gorgeous body against his chest, crushing her flush against him. His mouth crashed down onto hers, desperate, bruising, and entirely starving. Penelope gasped against his lips, her hands instinctively flying up to grip the lapels of his Tom Ford suit. The kiss was a war of grief and relief, tasting of salt, tears, and 2 years of agonizing separation. He kissed her until she was dizzy, his hands roaming frantically over her soft curves, mapping the geography of the body he had thought was lost to him forever. When he finally pulled away, he rested his forehead against hers. They were both panting, their breath mingling in the dark, dusty air. "I am going to kill Mitchell Graham," Dominic whispered against her lips, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, absolute promise of violence. "I am going to tear his life apart, piece by bloody piece. I am going to erase his name from the earth for what he forced you to do." "Dominic, the feds," Penelope warned, terrified. "Let them come," Dominic growled, his dark eyes burning with a psychotic, possessive full as he looked down at her. "They stole my wife. Now I am going to show the United States government what a real monster looks like. We are leaving, right now." He grabbed her hand, his grip unyielding and warm, pulling her away from the locked grate and out of the darkness. The hunt was over, but the true war was just beginning. Did Penelope make the right choice to save her brother? Or should she have trusted the Mafia Boss to protect them? The line between betrayal and sacrifice has never been blurrier, and Dominic Gallo is about to paint Boston red to reclaim his curvy queen. If you couldn't get enough of this intense, high-stakes mafia romance, hit that like button, share this story with your fellow drama lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more dark, twisty underworld tales.